Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking into something called kinship studies.
hmm
These were like an early way scientists tried to see if behaviors, maybe especially psychological disorders, have a genetic side to them. Do they run in families?
Exactly. These family studies, or pedigree studies as they're sometimes called, were really fundamental back when researchers first started trying to figure out um, how heritable different traits might be.
Right.
The basic idea is pretty simple, really. If you see a condition popping up again and again across generations in a family,
It makes you wonder if there's a genetic reason.
precisely, it suggests there could be a genetic link worth investigating.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. How do these kinship studies actually work? Like, what are they doing?
Well, mostly they're looking at how often a certain behavior or disorder shows up within a family and across different generations of that family.
Okay.
Sometimes these studies are longitudinal.
Meaning they follow the families for a long time.
Yeah, exactly, over years, even decades sometimes. And often they use what's called a case control design.
Case control. How does that work?
So you take a group of people who have the cases, and compare them to a group who don't the controls. Then you look back at their family histories.
Comparing the family trees, sort of.
Kinda, yeah. You're looking for differences, especially anything that might suggest a pattern of genetic inheritance being more common in the families of the cases.
I see. That makes sense. You mentioned a couple of examples earlier, the Galvin family and Siddhartha Mukherjee's family. Can you tell us more about those? They sound like good illustrations.
Sure. The Galvin family, this was in Colorado Springs back in the 1960s. It's a really powerful example.
What happened?
Well, there were 12 children, 10 sons, 2 daughters. And out of those 12 kids, 6 of the sons developed schizophrenia.
6 out of 12. Wow, that's incredibly high.
It is extremely high. This story, it's documented in the book Hidden Valley Road, and it became a major focus for researchers. People like Linda Lisi studied them extensively.
So they didn't just hear the story, they actually studied the family.
Oh, yes. They collected real empirical data. Blood samples for DNA testing, detailed histories. It was systematic research that really did contribute to showing a genetic link to schizophrenia.
Okay, so that's one type of situation.
Mhm.
How does that contrast with the story from Siddhartha Mukherjee's book, The Gene?
Right, so Mukherjee talks about his own family. His uncle, Jagu, and his cousin, Moni, both suffered from schizophrenia.
Okay, another family connection.
Yes, but the initial family understanding was different. They thought Jagu's illness was maybe triggered by the trauma he went through during the partition of India and Pakistan.
An environmental explanation, sort of.
Exactly. But then later, his cousin Moni also developed schizophrenia, and Moni hadn't experienced that same kind of trauma.
Which makes you think maybe it wasn't just the trauma for Jago either.
Precisely. It raised the question, could there be something else going on? Something not purely environmental, maybe something genetic passed down.
But you said this was different from the Galvin case.
Yeah, the key difference is the type of data. Mukherjee's account is largely anecdotal. It's a personal family story, hugely important for pointing researchers in a certain direction, maybe suggesting what to study.
But not the same as collecting blood samples and doing structured interviews, like with the Galvins.
Exactly. The Galvin study involved collecting empirical, measurable data. Mukherjee's story is more like a very compelling clue, a starting point for inquiry rather than the inquiry itself.
Got it. Anecdotal versus empirical. Okay. So when researchers do focus on families like this, what are the pros and cons? What makes it useful and what are the challenges?
Well, one advantage is that focusing on a family can kind of narrow down the genetic picture. You have less overall genetic variability compared to studying unrelated people.
Okay, a smaller gene pool to sift through, maybe?
Sort of, yeah. It can sometimes make it a bit easier to spot specific genetic patterns or influences. Plus, families often share similar environments.
Right. Same house, maybe similar diets, activity levels.
Exactly. So that helps to some extent control for some of those environmental variables that could also play a role.
Okay, so potentially less genetic noise and maybe a bit more environmental consistency. What about the downsides? The difficulties?
A really big one is getting reliable information, especially when you try to go back more than 1 or 2 generations.
You mean like asking about great-grandparents?
Yeah, you're often relying on people's memories, family stories passed down, and, memory isn't perfect, things get distorted, forgotten.
Sure.
And another major issue is diagnosis. How we define and diagnose psychological disorders has changed a lot over the decades.
So we're trying to say if Great Uncle Joe definitely had clinical depression back in 1930 based on a story.
Exactly. It's really problematic without actual clinical records from that time. A retrospective diagnosis is tricky, to say the least.
Okay, so kinship studies, historically important, still give us clues, but definitely have limitations, especially with older data. Let's maybe dive into some specific examples now, how researchers have used this approach for particular disorders.
Sounds good. We could start with depression. There's a really interesting longitudinal study by Weissman and her colleagues, published in 2005. It followed families over a long time.
Longitudinal, okay. Tell us about that one. What did they look at?
They tracked 161 grandchildren, plus their parents and their grandparents, so 3 generations.
Wow.
And they did this for over 20 years. The goal was to see if major depressive disorder had a genetic component passed down through these families.
How did they choose the families?
They deliberately picked families considered high risk and low risk for depression. The original depressed group, the grandparents, were initially patients at a mood disorder clinic. The non-depressed control grandparents were from the same community.
Okay, and tracking them for 20 years, how did they gather the information? That sounds like a massive effort.
It really was very thorough. They interviewed the parent and child generations multiple times, 4 waves of interviews. Then, as the original child generation grew up and had their own kids...
The grandchildren in the study.
Right, they started studying them too. And crucially, the clinicians doing the interviews didn't know about past diagnoses or what was found in earlier interviews.
That's called being blind to the condition.
Right.
Like, helps avoid bias.
Exactly. And the children, the 3rd generation, were evaluated carefully by 2 experienced clinicians, a child psychiatrist and a psychologist.
Very rigorous. Okay, so after all that, what did they find? What were the main takeaways?
The findings were pretty stark, actually. They saw very high rates of psychiatric disorders, mostly anxiety disorders. Interestingly, in the grandchildren who had 2 previous generations with major depression, by age 12, almost 60% of those kids had some kind of disorder.
60%. That's huge.
It is, and the risk of any disorder was significantly higher if both the grandparents and the parents had depression, compared to when only the parents had it.
So the grandparental history really mattered.
It seemed to, yeah. They also found that the more severe the parents' depression was, the higher the risk of mood disorders in their children.
Makes sense.
But here's another interesting wrinkle. If the parents were depressed, but the grandparents had no history of depression, that parental depression didn't seem to significantly increase the grandkids' risk.
Huh. So it's like the risk doesn't just come from the parents, but maybe that multi-generational pattern is particularly potent?
That's certainly what the findings suggest, a really complex picture across the generations.
Definitely. Okay, that's depression. What about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder? Have kinship studies looked into that?
Yes, there's a well-known case control study by Nestat and colleagues from 2000.
Case control, so comparing groups again.
Right. They recruited 80 people who had been diagnosed with OCD from various clinics, and they compared them to 73 control participants, people without OCD from the same communities.
Okay. And did they look at the families too?
That was the key part. They identified and then evaluated the first-degree relatives, parents, siblings, children of both groups.
So lots of relatives involved.
Yeah, about 343 relatives from the OCD group families and 300 from the control group families.
And how did they check if the relatives had OCD?
Psychiatrists conducted interviews with them using a semi-structured format. And again, importantly, the interviewers were kept blind. They didn't know whether the relative belonged to an OCD family or a control family.
Okay, same principle for objectivity. What did they find when they compared the relatives?
The main finding was pretty clear. The lifetime chance of having OCD was much higher for the relatives of people with OCD compared to the relatives of the controls.
How much higher?
It was about 11.7% in the OCD relatives versus only 2.7% in the control relatives. So a significant difference.
Definitely suggests a familial link. Did they see anything specific about obsessions versus compulsions?
They did note that the relatives of the OCD cases had higher rates of both obsessions, the intrusive thoughts and compulsions, the repetitive behaviors. But they mentioned the findings seemed a bit stronger, maybe more robust, for the obsessions part.
Interesting. So having a close relative with OCD, especially with the obsessive thinking component, seems linked to a higher personal risk. Okay. One more: eating disorders. Anorexia, bulimia.
Right. Lilienfeld and colleagues did a study in 1998 looking into that. It was also a case control design.
Okay.
They had groups of women diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, women with bulimia nervosa, and then a control group of women without diagnosed eating disorders.
And they looked at their families?
Yes, specifically their first-degree female relatives, so mothers, sisters, daughters. Around 460 relatives in total across the groups.
Why only female relatives?
That's a good question. Often in eating disorder research, especially historically, the focus was predominantly on females due to higher prevalence rates. They interviewed these relatives face-to-face if they could, or over the phone.
And what were they asking the relatives about?
They used structured interviews. One was specifically designed to get a family history of eating disorders and also what they called disordered eating behaviors, things that might not meet full diagnostic criteria but are still problematic.
Like extreme dieting or occasional binging, maybe.
Exactly that kind of thing. They also used another standard tool to assess for other conditions like depression, OCD, and other mental health issues in the relatives.
Right, to see if things co-occurred. And what did this study find about eating disorders running in families?
Well, it was a bit nuanced. They did find that the relatives of women with anorexia or bulimia had a higher risk of showing those disorder eating behaviors.
Okay, so some link there.
Yes, but interestingly, they did not find a significantly higher risk for the relatives having a full diagnosis of anorexia or bulimia themselves.
Oh, that is interesting. So the behaviors, yes, but not necessarily the full disorder.
That's what this particular study suggested. There was one specific finding. Relatives of the women with anorexia did seem to have a higher risk of obsessive-compulsive personality disorder.
OCPD, not OCD.
Right. OCPD, which is more about rigid perfectionism and control, rather than the specific obsessions and compulsions of OCD. That link was only seen with the anorexia group relatives.
Okay, and what about depression or OCD in the relatives? Were they linked to the eating disorders?
According to this study, not strongly. They found that major depression and OCD seemed to occur independently. The rates weren't significantly different between the relatives of the eating disorder groups and the relatives of the control group.
Huh. So it suggests maybe a familial tendency towards certain eating patterns, perhaps, but maybe not the full disorder itself. And maybe anorexia has slightly different familial links, like that OCPD connection, compared to bulimia.
That's a good way to put it. It implies that maybe certain underlying tendencies or traits might be passed down, but whether that actually develops into anorexia or bulimia could depend heavily on other things.
Environmental factors, personal experiences.
Other genes, maybe?
Exactly. It really highlights the complexity. It's probably not just one gene, and it's definitely not just genes.
Just thinking about all these studies, the depression one, the OCD one, the eating disorders one, it seems kinship studies, even with their limitations like relying on memory or dealing with changing diagnoses, they've still been pretty useful, haven't they? Oh, absolutely. They were crucial early on for establishing that genetics likely does play a role in these complex conditions. Seeing these patterns in families was a vital first step.
Showing that these things really can, as we said, run in families.
Precisely. And even now, while we have much more advanced genetic techniques, these family study approaches can still be valuable. They help researchers identify specific families or populations where certain genes might be having a stronger effect, guiding those more detailed molecular genetic studies.
So they kind of point the way for the gene hunters, in a sense.
You could say that, yeah. They help narrow the search sometimes.
Okay. So wrapping this up, what's the big picture message here about understanding psychological disorders?
I think it really underscores that while our genes definitely contribute to our risk or susceptibility for conditions like depression, OCD, eating disorders, schizophrenia, it's almost never a simple one-to-one cause.
It's not like inheriting eye color.
Not at all. These studies consistently point towards a really intricate dance between our genetic predispositions and, well, everything else. Our environment, our development, our experiences. It's all interacting.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe for you, our listener. When you consider what we've learned from watching these conditions track through families, and you see the complexities like how grandparental depression matters, or how eating behaviors might be linked but not the full disorder, what does that suggest about how we view our own individual risk, how these conditions actually develop?
Yeah, and where should research go next? How can we build on this kind of foundational work to get an even clearer picture?
Lots to think about there, about that complex web shaping our mental health. Thanks for joining us from this deep dive.